My hands trembled as I held the crumpled invitation, the gold-embossed letters blurring through my tears. Colonel Victor Rodriguez cordially invites you to celebrate 32 years of distinguished military service. The date was circled in red ink. Just 3 days away. What should have been the proudest moment of my father's career had become my family's final act of cruelty. They had erased me completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood outside the Fort Braxton Officers Club, watching through the tall windows as guests in their finest uniforms and evening wear mingled inside the grand ballroom. My father, resplendent in his dress blues with decades of ribbons adorning his chest, moved through the crowd like the decorated hero he was. My mother, Patricia, glided beside him in an elegant navy dress, her silver hair perfectly styled, playing the role of the devoted military wife she had mastered over 3 decades. But I wasn't supposed to be there. According to the guest list my brother Anthony had so carefully crafted, Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez didn't exist. The daughter who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, who had carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, who had earned the Bronze Star for valor, had been systematically deleted from her own father's legacy. I watched my youngest brother, Luis, hover near the dessert table, his eyes scanning the room nervously, avoiding the empty space where my name should have been on the family table. He knew what they had done. He had helped them do it. And in just a few hours, when Admiral Catherine Hayes took the podium to deliver her speech honoring my father's service, their carefully constructed lie would either hold or shatter into 1,000 pieces. But I had something they didn't know about. Something that would change everything. Hidden in my jacket pocket was a single manila envelope, its contents so explosive that even I had hesitated before deciding to bring it tonight. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free. Sometimes it burns down everything in its path. The Rodriguez family had always been built on the foundation of military tradition and unspoken hierarchies. My father, Victor Rodriguez, had climbed the ranks through sheer determination and an unwavering sense of duty that defined every aspect of our lives. From the time I could walk, I understood that honor, service, and family loyalty were the 3 pillars that held our world together. What I didn't understand then was how fragile those pillars could become when tested by greed, jealousy, and the desperate need for control. Our house in the affluent Raleigh suburbs was a monument to military precision. Every morning at precisely 0600, my father would emerge from his study in full uniform, his boots polished to mirror perfection, his bearing straight as the flagpole in our front yard. My mother Patricia would have breakfast waiting, the morning news tuned to military affairs, and the household schedule mapped out with the efficiency of a military operation. Anthony, my older brother by 4 years, was groomed from birth to inherit my father's legacy, even though he had never worn a uniform a day in his life. While Dad served overseas deployments, Anthony learned the art of manipulation at our mother's knee. He mastered the Rodriguez construction and development company that my father had built as a second career, turning military contracts into civilian wealth with the same strategic thinking Dad used on the battlefield. Luis, 2 years younger than me, was the family peacekeeper, the sensitive soul who absorbed tension like a sponge and tried desperately to keep everyone happy. He played violin, excelled in mathematics, and dreamed of becoming an engineer. But in the Rodriguez household, dreams that didn't involve either military service or the family business were considered luxuries we couldn't afford. And then there was me, Carmen Rodriguez, the middle child who refused to fit into any of the neat categories my family had created. From the moment I could hold a toy soldier, I was drawn to stories of courage and sacrifice. While Anthony learned profit margins and Luis practiced scales, I devoured biographies of military heroes and asked my father endless questions about his service. My mother never quite knew what to do with me. Patricia Rodriguez had married into military life with the understanding that wives supported, children obeyed, and family image trumped individual desire. She had mastered the art of the military spouse, organizing charity events, maintaining perfect dinner parties, and presenting a flawless facade to the base community. A daughter who wanted to carry a rifle instead of a purse didn't fit her carefully curated vision of femininity. But my father saw something different in me. During his rare moments home between deployments, he would find me in his study, poring over tactical manuals or studying maps of distant battlefields. Instead of dismissing my interest, he began to explain strategy, to share stories that weren't appropriate for polite dinner conversation, to treat me like the soldier I dreamed of becoming. When I announced at 16 that I intended to enlist after high school, the fault lines in our family became chasms. Anthony scoffed, insisting that I was being dramatic, that I would change my mind once I realized how difficult military life really was. My mother wept, not from pride, but from embarrassment at having raised a daughter who preferred combat boots to high heels. Luis said nothing, but I caught him watching me with a mixture of admiration and fear. Only my father supported my decision, though he did so quietly, in private conversations that felt like military briefings. He explained the challenges I would face as a woman in a male-dominated field, the extra scrutiny I would endure, the sacrifices that would be required. But he also shared his belief that service was the highest calling, that protecting others was worth any personal cost. The day I left for basic training, my father drove me to the recruitment station in silence. As I prepared to step out of the car, he handed me a small compass, worn and scratched from decades of use. "This guided me through every deployment," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it's yours. Let it bring you home safe." My mother didn't come to say goodbye. Anthony was busy with a business meeting. Luis hugged me briefly at the front door, whispering "be careful" in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. As the car pulled away from our house, I looked back to see Patricia watching from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. Basic training was exactly as brutal as my father had warned, but it was also the first place I felt truly at home. The physical challenges that broke other recruits only made me stronger. The mental pressure that caused others to quit only sharpened my focus. For the first time in my life, I was being judged purely on my abilities, not on my gender or my family's expectations. I excelled in marksmanship, scored in the top percentile on tactical assessments, and earned the grudging respect of drill instructors who had initially doubted my commitment. When I graduated with honors and received my assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 8 months later. Nothing, not even my father's stories or my extensive training, could have prepared me for the reality of combat. The heat that made every piece of equipment feel like it was on fire, the constant threat of improvised explosive devices, the weight of responsibility for the soldiers under my command, all of it combined to create a pressure that either forged you into something stronger, or broke you completely. I chose to be forged. Over 3 deployments spanning 6 years, I learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I held dying soldiers in my arms, and promised their mothers I would bring them home. I led convoys through hostile territory, and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for my entire unit. The Bronze Star came during my second tour, after I crawled through enemy fire to reach 2 wounded soldiers who had been pinned down by sniper fire. The medal itself was just metal and ribbon, but what it represented, the recognition that I had earned my place among warriors, meant everything to me. But heroism in a war zone doesn't translate easily to family dinners in suburban North Carolina. Each time I returned home on leave, I felt the distance growing wider between who I had become and who my family expected me to be. Anthony had expanded the construction business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, leveraging my father's military connections and my mother's social network to secure lucrative government contracts. Patricia had thrown herself into charity work, organizing fundraisers for military families that generated impressive donations and even more impressive social coverage. Luis had graduated from North Carolina State with a degree in engineering and was working for a firm that specialized in military base infrastructure. Everyone had found their niche, their way to be connected to military life without the messy reality of actually serving. Except they treated my actual service as an embarrassment, a phase I needed to outgrow rather than a calling I had embraced. During family gatherings, Anthony would steer conversations away from my deployments, claiming that war talk made the guests uncomfortable. My mother would introduce me to her friends as our Carmen, who's been traveling for work, as if 3 combat tours were equivalent to a business trip. The breaking point came during my father's promotion ceremony to full colonel. The entire extended family gathered at Fort Braxton for the formal ceremony, a milestone that represented the culmination of decades of dedicated service. As we posed for family photos afterward, I stood proudly in my dress uniform, my ribbons and decorations clearly visible. Later, when the official photos were distributed, I discovered that Anthony had arranged for a version to be created, where my military decorations had been digitally removed, making me appear to be wearing a simple business suit instead of my uniform. When I confronted him about it, he shrugged dismissively and said, "We thought it looked more balanced this way, more family appropriate." That was the moment I realized that my family's love was conditional, dependent on my willingness to minimize my achievements to make others more comfortable. My service, my sacrifices, my identity as a soldier, all of it was seen as something to be managed rather than celebrated. The final insult came when I learned about my father's retirement ceremony. For months Anthony had been planning what he called the event of a lifetime, a formal celebration at the Fort Braxton Officers Club that would honor 32 years of distinguished service. Invitations were sent to military dignitaries, business associates, family friends, and extended relatives from across the country. I learned about it by accident, overhearing a phone conversation between my mother and her sister about dress codes and hotel accommodation. When I asked Anthony about my invitation, he looked at me with mock surprise and said, "Oh, didn't Mom mention? We thought it would be better if you didn't attend. You know how you get at these formal events, and we want Dad's big night to go smoothly." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They were erasing me from the most important moment of my father's career.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Treating me like an embarrassment to be hidden rather than a daughter to be celebrated. When I appealed to my mother, she pursed her lips and said, "Carmen, you have to understand. This isn't about you. This is about your father's legacy, and we need to present the right image." Even Luis, who I had always counted on to be the voice of reason, simply looked away when I asked for his support. "Maybe it's for the best," he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. "You know how these things can get complicated." That night, alone in my small apartment in Fayetteville, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't let them erase me. I wouldn't let them rewrite history to suit their narrative. And I certainly wouldn't let them dishonor my father's legacy by pretending that his middle daughter, his fellow soldier, didn't exist. I spent the next 3 days gathering evidence, documents that told the real story of the Rodriguez family's relationship with my military service. Financial records showing how Anthony had used my combat veteran status to secure preferential treatment for government contracts. Correspondence between my mother and various military spouses' organizations, where she had claimed credit for my achievements as evidence of her own dedication to military family. Most damning of all were the emails between Anthony and several of his business associates, discussing how to manage the Carmen situation, to prevent my military record from overshadowing his own accomplishments in the civilian sector. In their own words, they had documented their plan to systematically diminish my role in the family narrative. But beyond the evidence of their betrayal, I had something else, something that even I had hesitated to use because of how completely it would devastate their carefully constructed facade. Hidden in my father's old military files, which he had asked me to organize during his transition to retirement, I had discovered correspondence that revealed a truth so shocking, it would redefine everything about our family's understanding of honor and service. Now standing outside the officers' club on the night of my father's retirement ceremony, I clutched that manila envelope, and prepared to either reclaim my place in the Rodriguez family, or burn it down entirely. Because sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong. Sometimes it's between truth and peace, and I had chosen truth. The warm North Carolina evening air carried the sound of laughter and conversation from inside the ballroom, a celebration of a life dedicated to service and sacrifice. In a few hours, Admiral Catherine Hayes would take the podium to deliver her formal remarks honoring my father's career. She had no idea that her speech would become the catalyst for a confrontation that would expose decades of family secrets and force everyone in that room to confront the difference between image and reality. I checked my watch and took a deep breath. It was time to go inside and remind my family that Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez could not be erased, ignored, or forgotten. Not tonight. Not ever again. The ballroom doors opened with a soft whoosh, releasing a wave of classical music and polite conversation into the humid evening air. I slipped inside, my civilian clothes feeling foreign after years of uniforms, and positioned myself near the back wall where shadows gathered between the elegant chandeliers. The Fort Braxton Officers Club had been transformed into something resembling a palace, with draped fabric softening the military severity and fresh flowers masking the scent of polish and protocol that usually dominated these spaces. My father stood at the center of it all, magnificent in his dress blues, the weight of 3 decades worth of ribbons and medals telling the story of a life dedicated to service. His silver hair was perfectly styled, His posture still ramrod straight despite his 54 years and his smile genuine as he moved from group to group, accepting congratulations and sharing memories with fellow officers who had served alongside him in conflicts spanning from the Gulf War to Afghanistan. I had forgotten how commanding his presence could be, how naturally he drew people into his orbit. Even in retirement, Colonel Victor Rodriguez possessed the kind of quiet authority that made junior officers stand a little straighter and senior officials seek his counsel. Watching him now, surrounded by the respect and admiration of his peers, I felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with longing that had defined my relationship with him for most of my adult life. The pride was tainted by the bitter knowledge of what my family had stolen from me tonight. As I scanned the crowd, I could see the deliberate architecture of my exclusion in every detail Anthony had orchestrated. The family table near the front of the room displayed 5 place settings instead of 6, with fresh white roses arranged to fill the space where my chair should have been. The slideshow playing on screens throughout the ballroom chronicled my father's career through carefully selected photographs that somehow managed to document 32 years of service without including a single image of his daughter in uniform. Most painfully, the official program listed family members by name and accomplishment. Anthony Rodriguez, Chief Executive Officer of Rodriguez Construction and Development, proudly supporting our military community through infrastructure excellence. Patricia Rodriguez, President of the Fort Braxton Military Spouses Association, dedicated to serving families who serve our nation. Luis Rodriguez, Senior Engineer with Blackwater Design Group, creating tomorrow's military installations today. The space where my entry should have appeared simply didn't exist, as if Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez had never been born. Anthony moved through the crowd with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his charm deployed with surgical precision. He paused at each group just long enough to ensure he was seen and remembered, collecting business cards and scheduling follow-up meetings with the casual efficiency of someone who viewed his father's retirement ceremony as a networking opportunity. I watched him corner General Morrison from the Base Engineering Corps, no doubt angling for another lucrative contract, while simultaneously keeping one eye on the guest list to ensure the right people were talking to the right people at the right time. Anthony had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to read social dynamics and position himself advantageously, a skill that had served him well in business but had turned him into something cold and calculating in personal relationships. My mother glided between guests with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the role of military spouse. Patricia Rodriguez was still strikingly beautiful at 51, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, her navy blue dress expensive enough to signal success but conservative enough to respect military tradition. She had mastered the art of being simultaneously impressive and deferential, charming enough to be memorable but careful never to overshadow her husband. But there was something brittle in her smile tonight, a tension around her eyes that suggested she was working harder than usual to maintain her composure. Perhaps she sensed that their carefully constructed narrative was somehow vulnerable, or maybe she simply felt the absence of the daughter she had chosen to exclude. Either way, the effort of maintaining her facade was visible to anyone who knew how to look for the crack. Luis lingered near the dessert table, his discomfort obvious to anyone who understood his body language. At 26, he had inherited our father's height and our mother's delicate features, but none of Anthony's social confidence or my military bearing. He fidgeted with his tie, checked his phone repeatedly, and kept glancing toward the entrance as if hoping for an escape route or dreading an unwelcome arrival. I knew he was thinking about me. Luis had always been the family conscience, the one who felt the weight of others' pain even when he was powerless to prevent it. He had been the one to call me 3 days ago, ostensibly to ask about my plans for the weekend, but really to gauge whether I knew about the ceremony. His relief when I claimed to be busy with work had been audible, but so had his guilt. Moving closer to the family table, I could hear fragments of conversation that confirmed my worst suspicions about tonight's agenda. Anthony was explaining to a group of his business associates how military families required careful balance, how too much focus on combat service could overshadow the equally important contributions of those who supported the mission from home. Patricia was describing her charity work to a cluster of military wives, emphasizing how important it was for families to present a united front in support of military value. Neither mentioned that they had a daughter and sister who had earned the Bronze Star for dragging wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. Neither acknowledged their military connection extended beyond marriage and business partnerships to include actual combat service. They had airbrushed me out of their story so completely that I wondered if they had convinced themselves I never existed. The cruelest cut came when I overheard my mother speaking to Mrs. Morrison, the general's wife, about the challenges of raising children in military families. "You have to be so careful about the messages you send," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when dispensing wisdom to younger spouses. "It's important that children understand service comes in many forms, not just the obvious one. Some people think they have to prove themselves through extreme measures, but real contribution comes from building something lasting." Mrs. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by Patricia's insights into military family dynamics. She had no way of knowing that the woman offering this sage advice had systematically erased her own daughter's military service from tonight's celebration. The hypocrisy was so breathtaking that I had to grip the wall behind me to keep from confronting them immediately. But I forced myself to wait, to observe, to gather more evidence of their deception before making my move. The manila envelope in my jacket felt heavier with each passing minute, its contents representing not just vindication for me but potential devastation for them. Because what I had discovered in my father's files wasn't just embarrassing or awkward, it was career-ending, reputation-destroying, information that would fundamentally alter how everyone in this room viewed the Rodriguez family legacy. As the evening progressed, I watched the subtle choreography of military social hierarchy play out around me. Junior officers approached senior officials with careful deference, while civilian contractors like Anthony navigated the complex protocols with studied casualness. Spouses clustered in groups defined by rank and social position, their conversations touching on safe topics like base housing and school districts while carefully avoiding anything controversial or divisive. My father moved through it all with the easy confidence of someone who had earned his place through decades of honorable service. He spoke warmly with enlisted personnel, shared strategic insights with fellow officers, and graciously accepted praise for his contributions to national security. This was his night, the culmination of a lifetime dedicated to something larger than himself, and he deserved every moment of recognition and respect. But I also noticed something that the other guests probably missed. Despite the celebration surrounding him, my father's eyes occasionally searched the crowd, a subtle furrow appearing between his brows as if he was looking for someone specific. During conversations, he would glance toward the entrance or scan the back of the room with the kind of tactical awareness that never fully disappears from professional soldiers. Was he looking for me? Had he expected me to be here despite Anthony's machinations? The possibility that my father might have been hoping for my presence, that he might not have been complicit in my exclusion, sent a surge of hope through my chest that I quickly tried to suppress. Hope was dangerous tonight. Hope could make me hesitate when decisive action was required. The formal program began at 8:30 with the traditional military precision that marked all important ceremonies. A young captain served as master of ceremonies, guiding the audience through the ritual of honoring distinguished service. There were presentations of plaques and certificates, readings of official commendations, and speeches from various officials praising my father's contributions to mission readiness and troop welfare. Anthony took the podium during the family tribute portion, his remarks carefully crafted to emphasize his own role in supporting military families through business excellence, while positioning our mother as a selfless advocate for military community. He spoke eloquently about the sacrifices military families made, the challenges of deployment separations, and the importance of honoring those who served. But he never mentioned that his own sister had served 3 combat tours. He never acknowledged that the Rodriguez family's understanding of military sacrifice extended beyond worrying about deployed relatives to actually being the one carrying a rifle in hostile territory. His speech was a masterpiece of selective truth, technically accurate but fundamentally dishonest in its omission. Luis spoke briefly, his remarks focusing on the engineering challenges of modern military installations, and his pride in contributing to base security through infrastructure improvement. His voice shook slightly as he thanked our parents for instilling values of service and dedication, and I caught him glancing toward the back of the room where I stood hidden in shadow. My mother's contribution was equally polished, a heartfelt tribute to the challenges and rewards of military spouse life that drew appreciative nods from the audience. She spoke about the strength required to maintain family stability during uncertain times, the pride of supporting something greater than individual ambition, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that their sacrifices contributed to national security. Again, no mention of the daughter who had actually worn the uniform, who had actually been shot at by enemy forces, who had actually carried the flag into combat zones where abstract concepts like honor and duty became matters of life and death. They had found a way to claim ownership of military sacrifice, while erasing the family member who had actually made it. As the formal presentations concluded, and the program moved toward its climax, Admiral Catherine Hayes rose from her seat at the head table. At 57, she was an imposing figure, her uniform crisp, her bearing commanding, her reputation for both tactical brilliance and absolute integrity well established throughout the military community. She had served as my father's commanding officer during his final assignment, and was widely regarded as one of the most respected flag officers of her generation. Admiral Hayes approached the podium with measured steps, her expression serious as she arranged her notes and adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent in the way that only happens when someone of genuine authority prepares to speak. Even the civilian guests seemed to understand that they were about to hear from someone whose words carried the weight of decades of military experience. But I knew something the audience didn't. I knew that Admiral Hayes had been more than just my father's commanding officer during his final years of service. She had been his confidant, his mentor, and ultimately the keeper of secrets that could reshape everything this audience believed about honor, duty, and the true meaning of service. The manila envelope in my jacket contained copies of correspondence between my father and Admiral Hayes that revealed truths my family had never suspected. As she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, I felt the weight of decision pressing down on me. In a few minutes, when she finished her formal remarks and opened the floor for final comments, I would have to choose between preserving my family's facade and demanding acknowledgement of my own service, between keeping their secrets and revealing truths that would change everything. The Admiral's words washed over me as I wrestled with the magnitude of what I was about to do. She spoke eloquently about my father's contributions to military readiness, his dedication to troop welfare, and his unwavering commitment to the values that defined professional service. Her praise was genuine, her respect obvious, and her words painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to something larger than personal ambition. But she also began to venture into territory that made Anthony shift uncomfortably in his seat and caused my mother's smile to tighten almost imperceptibly. Admiral Hayes spoke about the importance of family in sustaining military careers, about the different ways service members' relatives contributed to mission success, and about her deep respect for military families who understood that some sacrifices required more than emotional support. Colonel Rodriguez, she said, her gaze finding my father in the crowd, has always understood that service is not just about personal achievement, but about inspiring others to embrace the values that make our military strong. Throughout his career, he has been not just a soldier but a teacher, a mentor, and a father who understood that the greatest legacy any service member can leave is the next generation's commitment to continuing the mission. I felt my heart rate accelerate as her words seemed to point towards something larger than standard retirement ceremony rhetoric. Admiral Hayes was building towards something, constructing an argument or preparing to make a point that would require the foundation she was carefully laying. And based on what I had discovered in my father's files, I suspected I knew where she was heading. The moment of decision was approaching faster than I had anticipated. Soon, very soon, I would have to step out of the shadows and claim my place in this story, regardless of the consequences for my family's carefully maintained image. Because the truth was larger than their comfort, more important than their reputation, and certainly more valuable than their approval. As Admiral Hayes paused to sip from her water glass, her eyes scanning the crowd with the same tactical assessment I had learned to recognize in combat zones, I reached into my jacket and felt the edge of the manila envelope. Whatever happened next, Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez would not be erased, ignored, or forgotten. Not tonight, not by anyone. The silence in the ballroom stretched taut as Admiral Hayes reached the crescendo of her speech, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even seasoned officers lean forward in their seats. I had positioned myself near the side wall, close enough to hear every word but far enough from the family table to avoid detection. My hand remained pressed against the manila envelope in my jacket, its contents burning like a live grenade waiting to detonate. Throughout Colonel Rodriguez's distinguished career, Admiral Hayes continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests, I have witnessed his unwavering commitment, not just to military excellence, but to the principle that true service extends beyond individual achievement. He has always understood that the measure of a leader is not found in personal accolades, but in the courage and dedication of those who follow his example. Anthony's practiced smile never wavered, but I caught the subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he was growing uncomfortable with the direction of the Admiral's remark. My mother maintained her composed expression, but her fingers had begun to twist the pearl bracelet around her wrist, a nervous habit she had developed during my father's longer deployments. Louis sat frozen in his chair, his face pale beneath the ballroom's golden lighting. Of all my family members, he alone seemed to sense that something significant was building beneath the surface of what should have been a routine retirement ceremony. His eyes darted toward the entrances, toward Admiral Hayes, and occasionally toward the empty space at their table where my place setting should have been. But tonight, Admiral Hayes said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, I want to share something that goes beyond official commendations and service records. Something that speaks to the true character of the man we are honoring and the legacy he has built. Not just as a soldier, but as a father. The change in her tone sent a ripple of attention through the audience. This was departing from the standard script of military retirement ceremonies, venturing into territory that could be either deeply moving or potentially uncomfortable. I felt my pulse quicken as I recognized the setup for what I suspected was coming. Admiral Hayes reached into her jacket and withdrew a folder, its manila surface worn with age and handling. The sight of it made my breath catch because I recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one hidden in my father's personal files, the one that contained correspondence between them that my family had never seen. The one that held secrets capable of redefining everything about the Rodriguez family narrative. 6 months ago, the Admiral continued, Colonel Rodriguez came to my office with a request that initially surprised me. He wanted to discuss something that had been weighing on his conscience for several years, something he felt needed to be addressed before his retirement became official. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Anthony's smile finally cracked, replaced by a look of barely controlled anxiety. My mother had gone completely still, her hands frozen in her lap, her eyes locked on Admiral Hayes with the intensity of someone trying to read an enemy's tactical intentions. My father himself looked strangely peaceful, as if a burden he had carried for years was finally about to be lifted. He sat straight in his chair, his dress uniform impeccable, his medals catching the light as he breathed steadily and waited for whatever was about to unfold. The colonel was concerned, Admiral Hayes said, opening the folder and glancing at its contents, about certain misrepresentations that had been made regarding his family's military service. Specifically, he had become aware that some members of his family had been systematically omitting or diminishing the combat record of one of his children in order to present what they considered a more palatable narrative to their business and social contact. The words hit the ballroom like artillery shells. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The carefully maintained atmosphere of celebration dissolved into something electric and dangerous. I watched Anthony's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and rising panic as he began to understand what was happening. My mother's composure finally cracked. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. For the first time in decades, Patricia Rodriguez found herself in a situation her social training hadn't prepared her to handle. The woman who had spent 30 years managing military protocol and civilian expectations was facing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed facade. Admiral Hayes continued without pause, her voice steady and implacable. Colonel Rodriguez provided me with extensive documentation showing how his daughter's Bronze Star for Valor, earned during combat operations in Afghanistan, had been deliberately omitted from family biographical material, how her 3 combat deployments had been misrepresented as overseas work assignments in social settings, how her rank and military achievements had been systematically downplayed or ignored entirely in contexts where they might overshadow civilian accomplishments. The documentation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what my father had done. Somehow he had been aware of my family's campaign to erase my service record. He had been collecting evidence of their deception, building a case for what was happening here tonight. The manila envelope in my pocket wasn't the only explosive revelation waiting to detonate. Luis had gone white as paper, his eyes darting frantically between Admiral Hayes and his family member. Anthony was whispering urgently to his wife who had joined them at the family table, while my mother sat rigid as a statue, her world crumbling around her in real time. What particularly troubled Colonel Rodriguez, Admiral Hayes continued, her voice gaining strength, was discovering that his eldest son had been using his sister's veteran status to secure preferential treatment for government contracts, while simultaneously minimizing her actual service record in public settings. The colonel felt this represented not just personal dishonesty, but a fundamental violation of military values. Anthony shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. Admiral, with all due respect, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. My family has always been incredibly proud of Carmen's service, and any suggestion otherwise is simply incorrect. The use of my name sent a shock through the room. For the first time all evening, someone had acknowledged that Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez existed, that she was part of the Rodriguez family, that her service record was real and documented. But Anthony's desperate attempt at damage control only made the situation more volatile. Admiral Hayes looked at him with the kind of cool assessment that had intimidated enemy commanders and uncooperative subordinates for decades. "Mr. Rodriguez, your father provided me with copies of emails in which you specifically instructed business associates to avoid mentioning your sister's military record when seeking government contracts. He also shared social media posts where family military connections were discussed without any reference to the only family member who had actually served in combat. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating." Anthony's face cycled through several shades of red as he realized that his father had been documenting his deception for months, possibly years. The golden son who had built his success on leveraging military connections while denying military service was being exposed in front of the very audience whose respect he had worked so hard to cultivate. But Admiral Hayes wasn't finished. Colonel Rodriguez was also deeply troubled by indications that certain family members had been actively discouraging his daughter from attending tonight's ceremony. That they had, in fact, deliberately excluded her from an event honoring the military service she had not only supported but embodied through her own distinguished combat record. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battle. Around the room I could see guests processing the implications, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to judgment. Military audiences had little tolerance for stolen valor or dishonored service, and the suggestion that someone had been systematically erasing a combat veteran's record for personal gain was the kind of violation that transcended political or social division. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Carmen chose not to attend tonight. We would never exclude our own daughter from such an important event." The lie was so transparent, so obviously desperate, that it seemed to make the situation worse rather than better. Admiral Hayes consulted her folder again, and I realized with growing amazement that my father had been even more thorough in his documentation than I had imagined. "Miss Rodriguez, your husband provided me with copies of text messages between family members specifically discussing how to ensure your daughter remained unaware of tonight's ceremony. He also shared email correspondence in which the guest list was deliberately modified to exclude her name, and social media posts announcing the event that were specifically configured to prevent her from seeing them. The level of betrayal was staggering. Not only had my family systematically erased my service record, they had actively conspired to exclude me from my own father's retirement ceremony. But even more shocking was the realization that my father had been aware of their deception and had been quietly building a case against them. Why hadn't he said something to me directly? Why had he allowed me to believe I was facing this alone? The questions burned in my mind, but they were overshadowed by a growing sense of vindication. For the first time in years, someone with unquestioned authority was publicly acknowledging what had been done to me. Admiral Hayes closed the folder and looked directly at my father. "Colonel Rodriguez asked me to use tonight's ceremony to correct these misrepresentations, and to ensure that his daughter's service record was properly acknowledged. He felt that his retirement would be incomplete, dishonest even, if it perpetuated a false narrative about his family's military contributions." The ballroom had become completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving, sensing that something significant was unfolding in the dining area. Every eye in the room was focused on the drama playing out at the family table, where decades of carefully maintained facades were collapsing in real time. My father stood slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the chaos surrounding him. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority that had commanded respect throughout his military career. "Admiral Hayes is correct," he said, his words carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "I have spent the last year becoming increasingly concerned about how my daughter's military service has been misrepresented by certain members of my family." Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez earned the Bronze Star for valor during combat operations in Afghanistan. She served 3 deployments in hostile territory, led soldiers under enemy fire, and conducted herself with the kind of courage that represents the best of our military tradition. The formal acknowledgement hit me like a physical blow. After years of having my service minimized, ignored, or actively erased, hearing my father publicly state my rank, my decorations, and my combat record felt like a form of absolution I hadn't dared to hope for. But he wasn't finished. Carmen was deliberately excluded from tonight's ceremony by family members who felt her military record was somehow inappropriate or uncomfortable for the image they wanted to present. This exclusion represents not just personal cruelty, but a fundamental violation of the values I have spent my career defending. Anthony looked like he was going to be. My mother had begun crying silently, tears streaming down her face as 30 years of social positioning crumbled around her. Luis remained frozen, his face a mask of horror as he realized the magnitude of what his family had done and what it was costing them. Admiral Hayes nodded approvingly at my father's statement, then turned her attention back to the stunned audience. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to publicly acknowledge the service of Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez, who earned the Bronze Star for valor for actions above and beyond the call of duty during Operation Enduring Freedom. Her record includes 3 combat deployments, commendations for leadership under fire, and the gratitude of soldiers whose lives she saved through her courage and dedication. The recognition I had dreamed of, fought for, and been denied was finally happening. But it was occurring in the most public and devastating way possible for my family. As Admiral Hayes spoke, I realized that my father had orchestrated this entire revelation, that he had spent months preparing for this moment when truth would finally triumph over image management. But I also knew that my own moment of decision was approaching, because hidden in my jacket pocket was evidence that would take this confrontation to an even more devastating level. Evidence that would not just restore my place in the family narrative, but would reveal secrets about my father's own service that could redefine everything about how his career was remembered. The choice was mine. I could remain in the shadows and let Admiral Hayes' revelation stand as vindication enough, or I could step forward and share what I had discovered about the true cost of maintaining family secrets. Either way, the Rodriguez family would never be the same after tonight. The weight of decision pressed against my chest like body armor in the Afghan heat. I could feel the manila envelope burning against my ribs, its contents representing a choice between allowing my father's carefully orchestrated vindication to stand or revealing truths that would fundamentally alter how everyone in this room understood the concept of heroism itself. Admiral Hayes had paused in her remarks, allowing the gravity of her revelations to settle over the stunned audience. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the soft sound of my mother's continued weeping and the nervous shuffling of guests, who had come expecting a routine retirement ceremony, and instead found themselves witnessing the public dismantling of a family's carefully constructed facade. My father remained standing, his posture erect despite the emotional devastation surrounding him, but I could see something in his expression that others might miss, a flicker of uncertainty as his eyes searched the crowd. He was looking for me. After orchestrating this entire revelation, after spending months documenting his family's betrayal of my service record, he was scanning the room to see if I was present to witness my vindication. The realization hit me like incoming artillery. My father had planned this entire confrontation not just to restore my honor, but to force a reckoning with family dynamics that had poisoned our relationships for years. He had weaponized his own retirement ceremony to deliver justice for his daughter, but he had done so without knowing whether I would be there to see it. Anthony was whispering frantically with his wife, their heads bent together in desperate consultation, while other guests watched with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. His business empire was built on leveraging military connections and veteran status, but now everyone in this room knew that he had actively worked to suppress his own sister's combat record, while claiming reflected glory from family military service. Luis had begun crying quietly, his shoulders shaking as the full magnitude of what his family had done became undeniable. The gentle brother who had always tried to keep peace, who had helped orchestrate my exclusion through his silence, was finally confronting the cost of choosing comfort over conscience. His tears weren't just for me, I realized, but for the family unity that was dying in front of 200 witnesses. My mother had stopped crying but remained motionless, her face a mask of devastation as decades of social positioning crumbled around her. Patricia Rodriguez had built her identity around being the perfect military spouse, the woman who understood protocol and maintained appearances while supporting her husband's career. Now she was being publicly exposed as someone who had systematically dishonored her own daughter's military service for the sake of social convenience. But Admiral Hayes wasn't finished with her revelations. She opened her folder again, consulting documents that made my pulse quicken because I suspected what was coming next. My father had shared more than just evidence of my family's betrayal. He had entrusted Admiral Hayes with information that went to the heart of what military service really meant. Information that would transform tonight from a simple exposure of family dynamics into something approaching a moral reckoning. Colonel Rodriguez also wanted me to address something else tonight, Admiral Hayes said, her voice cutting through the ballroom's tension like a blade. Something that speaks to the character not just of his family but of the daughter whose service has been so shamefully misrepresented. She reached into the folder and withdrew what appeared to be an official military document, its seal and formatting instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with military paperwork. Around the room I could see current and former service members leaning forward, understanding that they were about to hear something significant. 3 years ago, Admiral Hayes continued, Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez was offered a direct commission to lieutenant based on her exemplary combat record and leadership capabilities. The offer came with assignment to a prestigious position at the Pentagon, working on strategic planning for future military operations. It represented the kind of career advancement that most enlisted personnel only dream of achieving. The revelation sent another shock through the assembled guests. A direct commission from enlisted to officer ranks was extremely rare, reserved for individuals who had demonstrated exceptional leadership and tactical brilliance under combat conditions. The offer of a Pentagon assignment made it even more prestigious, indicating that my combat performance had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. But I knew what was coming next, and the knowledge made my chest tighten with renewed pain. Because Admiral Hayes wasn't just going to reveal that I had been offered this extraordinary opportunity. She was going to explain why I had turned it down, and that explanation would expose the final, most devastating layer of my family's betrayal. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez declined this commission, Admiral Hayes said, her voice carrying a note of profound regret. She turned down what could have been a transformative career opportunity, because she had been led to believe that her continued military service was causing problems for her family's business relationships and social standing. The words hit the ballroom like a physical blow. Around the room I could see military personnel processing the implications of what they had just heard. I had sacrificed my own career advancement, had walked away from recognition and opportunity, because my family had convinced me that my service was an embarrassment to them. Anthony's face had gone gray, his earlier panic replaced by the kind of shock that comes with realizing the true magnitude of destruction you've caused. My mother looked up for the first time since the revelations began, her eyes wide with something that might have been horror or might have been belated understanding of what her social priorities had cost her daughter. But Admiral Hayes still wasn't finished. She consulted her folder again, and I felt a chill of recognition as she withdrew a document I knew all too well. It was a copy of the letter I had written to my commanding officer, explaining my decision to decline the commission and transition out of active duty. A letter I had shared with no one except my father during one of our rare private conversations. In her letter declining the commission, Admiral Hayes read, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of controlled anger. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez wrote, and I quote, "While I am deeply honored by this opportunity, I feel I must prioritize my family's needs over my personal career ambition. My continued military service appears to be creating difficulties for family members who have built their civilian careers around military connections. And I cannot in good conscience allow my service record to become a source of family conflict." The letter's contents were devastating precisely because they revealed the depth of manipulation my family had employed. They hadn't just erased my service record from their public narrative. They had convinced me that my very presence as an active duty soldier was harmful to their civilian success, that my sacrifice and dedication were somehow selfish impositions on their social and business aspirations. My father closed his eyes as Admiral Hayes read my words, his face etched with what looked like physical pain. For the first time I understood that he had known about my decision to leave the military, had known the real reasons behind it, and had spent the years since watching his family benefit from the career sacrifice they had manipulated me into making. The audience was completely silent now, absorbing the full scope of what had been revealed. This wasn't just about excluded invitations or omitted achievement. This was about a family that had systematically destroyed one of their own members' career prospects while simultaneously profiting from her service record. The hypocrisy was so profound, so morally bankrupt, that even civilian guests seemed to understand its implication. But I could no longer remain in the shadows. The vindication my father had orchestrated was more complete than I had dared to hope for. But it was also incomplete in ways that only I could address. Because hidden in the manila envelope pressed against my ribs was evidence that would add another dimension to tonight's revelations. Evidence that would transform this from a story about family betrayal into something approaching a meditation on the true nature of heroism and sacrifice. I stepped forward from the shadows along the wall, my movement causing heads to turn throughout the ballroom. The civilian clothes I wore felt inadequate as I walked toward the front of the room. But my bearing remained military despite the years since I had last worn a uniform in public. Training doesn't disappear just because you've been forced to abandon your calling, Admiral Hayes, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. With your permission, I would like to add something to tonight's record. The sound of my voice caused a collective intake of breath from the assembled guests. After an hour of being discussed in third person, after being simultaneously vindicated and mourned as if I were absent or dead, Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez was finally present to speak for herself. My father's face transformed as he saw me, relief and pride warring with concern about what I might be planning to reveal. Admiral Hayes nodded formally, stepping slightly aside to make room at the podium while maintaining her position of authority over the proceeding. Anthony half rose from his chair, his mouth opening as if to object, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. Perhaps she had finally realized that their options for damage control had been exhausted, that the time for managing narratives and controlling information had passed. Luis was staring at me with something approaching awe, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The sister he had helped exclude, the soldier he had allowed them to erase, was standing before him in full possession of her dignity and her voice. I reached into my jacket and withdrew the manila envelope, its contents representing the final piece of a puzzle that had taken me months to assemble. What I had discovered in my father's personal files wasn't just evidence of my family's betrayal. It was documentation of something far more profound, something that would redefine how everyone in this room understood the relationship between public recognition and private sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, looking out over the stunned audience, my father and Admiral Hayes have done me the honor of restoring my service record to tonight's narrative. They have exposed the systematic campaign my family conducted to erase my military achievements while profiting from military connection. But there's something else that needs to be said tonight, something that goes to the heart of what we really mean when we talk about military families and sacrifice. I opened the envelope and withdrew its contents, documents that had shaken me to my core when I first discovered them among my father's personal papers. Letters, commendations and after-action reports that told a story my family had never heard, that revealed aspects of my father's service that he had never shared with anyone except the military colleagues who had witnessed them firsthand. My father's official service record, I continued, lists his participation in Operation Desert Storm, his multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and his steady promotion through the ranks based on exemplary leadership and tactical excellence. What it doesn't mention, what he has never allowed to be made public, is that Colonel Victor Rodriguez has been personally responsible for saving more lives under combat conditions than any officer of his generation. The revelation sent another ripple of attention through the audience, but this time the energy felt different. Instead of the horrified fascination that had accompanied the exposure of my family's betrayal, there was a sense of anticipation, of finally approaching something worthy of celebration rather than condemnation. I held up a document that bore the official seal of the Department of Defense, its contents representing information that had been classified until recently. 3 months ago, newly declassified after-action reports revealed that my father's tactical decisions during a single operation in Afghanistan prevented what intelligence estimates suggest would have been the largest casualty event of the entire conflict. My father's face had gone pale, his eyes widening as he realized what I was about to reveal. These were details he had never shared with his family, achievements he had buried in classified files rather than claim credit for outcomes that had required others to make tremendous sacrifice. The operation occurred during my second deployment, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was sharing. Colonel Rodriguez received intelligence indicating a planned attack on a forward operating base housing over 800 American and Allied personnel. The intelligence was fragmentary, the source questionable, and the proposed response carried enormous risks for the teams that would have to execute it. Around the room, current and former military personnel were listening with the kind of focused attention reserved for combat stories, understanding that they were about to hear about decisions made under the kind of pressure that defined military leadership at its highest level. My father made the decision to authorize a preemptive strike based on incomplete intelligence, knowing that if he was wrong he would be responsible for American casualties in an unnecessary engagement. If he was right but the operation failed, he would be responsible for even more American casualties from the attack he had tried to prevent. The weight of command responsibility was something every military officer in the audience understood, but few had ever faced decisions of this magnitude. My father had been forced to choose between certain criticism and potential catastrophe, between personal safety and the protection of hundreds of soldiers under his indirect command. The operation succeeded, I said, consulting the declassified document. The preemptive strike neutralized the planned attack and saved an estimated 600 to 800 American and Allied lives. But my father never claimed credit for this decision, because doing so would have required revealing intelligence sources and methods that needed to remain classified. The audience was completely absorbed now, understanding that they were hearing about the kind of heroism that went unrecognized because it couldn't be publicly acknowledged. My father had spent years accepting routine commendations for standard military excellence, while keeping silent about decisions that had prevented massive casualties. But there was more to the story, details that would complete the circle of tonight's revelations and explain why my father had finally decided to orchestrate this public reckoning with family honor and military value. One of the soldiers whose life was saved by my father's decision, I said, looking directly at Admiral Hayes, was Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez. I was part of the unit that would have been targeted in the planned attack. My father saved my life along with hundreds of others, and never told anyone in our family that he had done so. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. My father had spent years watching his family erase his daughter's military record, while knowing that his own recognized heroism was the only reason she was alive to be dishonored. He had endured their betrayal of military values while keeping silent about his own sacrifice to protect those same values. The ballroom had become a cathedral of silence, the weight of revelation pressing down on everyone present. This wasn't just a story about family dysfunction or career advancement. This was about the hidden costs of military service, about sacrifices that went unrecognized because recognition would compromise their effectiveness. My father was crying now, tears streaming down his face as secrets he had carried for years were finally exposed to the light. Admiral Hayes had moved to stand beside him, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and respect that spoke volumes about their shared understanding of command responsibility. But my family's reckoning was far from over, because what I had revealed about my father's heroism only made their treatment of my service record more shameful, more incomprehensible. They had dishonored a combat veteran, while living under the protection her father had provided, enjoying the benefits of military connections, while erasing the military achievements that gave those connections meaning. Anthony looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his business empire and social standing built on foundations that had just been revealed as fundamentally hollow. My mother was staring at my father as if seeing him for the first time, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of the man she had married and the daughter she had betrayed. And Luis was looking at me with something approaching wonder, finally comprehending the scope of service and sacrifice that his family had tried so hard to erase from their narrative. The moment had come for final choices, for decisions about forgiveness and reconciliation that would determine whether the Rodriguez family could be rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than comfortable lies. But first there was one more revelation that needed to be shared, one final piece of evidence that would transform tonight from an ending into a beginning. The silence that followed my revelation felt sacred, as if the ballroom had become a chapel where truth and sacrifice were finally being honored without pretense or political calculation. Every person in the room understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the exposure of family betrayal but the revelation of heroism that had operated in shadows for years, protecting lives while accepting no credit. Admiral Hayes stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent honoring military tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard tonight about service that goes beyond personal recognition, about families who both embody and betray military values, and about the complex relationships between public honor and private sacrifice. But most importantly, we have heard about the kind of courage that defines the best of our military tradition. She turned toward my father, her expression reflecting profound respect mixed with something approaching reverence. Colonel Rodriguez, your classified service record contains 17 separate instances where your tactical decisions under extreme pressure saved American lives. Your declassified record shows a steady progression of leadership roles and standard commendation. The difference between these two records illustrates everything about why military service requires not just courage, but humility. My father stood straighter despite his tears, accepting recognition for achievements he had never sought to publicize. Around the room, military personnel were rising to their feet in spontaneous tribute, understanding that they were in the presence of the kind of leader whose decisions had shaped their profession's highest standards. But Admiral Hayes wasn't finished. She opened her folder one final time, and withdrew a document I hadn't seen before, its official formatting and multiple signatures suggesting something significant. Tonight's revelations have clarified something that Colonel Rodriguez and I have been discussing for several months. The recommendation for promotion that has been pending review. The words sent a shock through the assembled audience. Promotion recommendations for retiring officers were extremely rare, typically reserved for individuals whose service records warranted recognition at the highest levels of military leadership. My father's face reflected surprise that mirrored my own. He clearly hadn't expected this additional honor, Based on newly declassified service records and in recognition of extraordinary leadership under combat conditions, Admiral Hayes announced, "It is my privilege to confirm that Colonel Victor Rodriguez has been promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately upon his transition to retired status." The promotion sent a wave of applause through the ballroom, but it also created a moment of profound irony that wasn't lost on anyone present. My family had spent years managing my father's image for social and business advantage, carefully curating his military connections while erasing inconvenient achievements. Now he was being promoted to general rank based on service records they had never known existed. Anthony looked shell-shocked, his business empire built on leveraging colonel-level military connections suddenly transformed by his father's elevation to general rank. But more than that, he was confronting the reality that his systematic betrayal of military values had been exposed to an audience that now included not just a respected colonel but a newly promoted general whose heroism had been documented at the highest levels of military command. My mother was staring at my father with something approaching awe, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of the man she had married and the daughter she had failed to honor. The woman who had spent decades managing military protocol and social positioning was realizing that her husband's true achievements dwarfed anything she had imagined possible. Luis had begun crying again, but these tears seemed different from his earlier devastation. There was something approaching relief in his expression, as if the weight of family secrets and complicity was finally being lifted from his shoulders. The gentle brother who had always tried to keep peace was finally seeing what peace actually looked like when built on truth rather than comfortable lies. But the evening's revelations weren't complete. Admiral Hayes gestured toward me, her expression indicating that my role in tonight's proceedings was far from over. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your father asked me to share one additional piece of information tonight, something that speaks to the family values that have been so prominently discussed." I felt a flutter of uncertainty as Admiral Hayes consulted her notes, unsure what additional revelations my father might have prepared. The manila envelope in my hands felt lighter now that its contents had been shared, but I sensed that the evening's emotional journey was approaching its true climax. 3 weeks ago, Admiral Hayes said, General Rodriguez came to my office with a request that initially surprised me. He wanted to know if there was any possibility of reversing your decision to decline the direct commission that had been offered to you several years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father had been working behind the scenes not just to restore my honor publicly, but to restore my career opportunities privately. The commission I had turned down, the Pentagon assignment I had sacrificed for family harmony might still be possible. The general's argument, Admiral Hayes continued, was that your decision had been made under false pretenses, based on family pressure that misrepresented the value of your service. He felt that you deserved the opportunity to reconsider that decision based on accurate information about how your military achievements were viewed by your commanding officers. Around the room, I could feel the audience processing the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't just about public vindication or family reconciliation. This was about the possibility of reclaiming a career path that had been sacrificed to family manipulation. My father stepped forward, his newly confirmed general's rank seeming to sit naturally on his shoulders despite the emotional turmoil of the evening. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions under pressure, but also the vulnerability of a father trying to repair damage he had allowed to occur. "Carmen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I can express tonight. I knew about your family's systematic campaign to erase your service record. I knew about the pressure they put on you to leave active duty, and I failed to intervene because I thought family unity was more important than individual justice." The admission was devastating in its honesty. My father was publicly acknowledging that he had been complicit in my family's betrayal, that his silence had enabled their systematic erasure of my military achievements. But he was also accepting responsibility in a way that created space for genuine reconciliation. "But I also want you to know," he continued, "that your service record speaks for itself to anyone who understands military values. The Bronze Star you earned was for actions that saved lives under conditions most soldiers will never face. The leadership you demonstrated in combat zones was recognized by every officer who served with you. And the sacrifice you made when you left active duty was not unnoticed by those of us who understood what you were giving up." The recognition I had craved for years was finally being offered, but it was coming at a moment when I understood its true cost. My father's public acknowledgement of my service was also his public acknowledgement of his own failure to protect me from family manipulation. The vindication was complete, but it required both of us to confront years of silence and complicity. Admiral Hayes stepped forward again, her folder now containing what appeared to be official military paperwork. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I have been authorized to offer you the opportunity to reconsider your previous decision regarding direct commission. The offer of promotion to lieutenant and assignment to strategic planning remains available, with the understanding that your previous decision was made under circumstances that have now been clarified. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across years of regret and sacrifice. The career path I had abandoned, the recognition I had been denied, the future I had given up for family harmony, all of it was being restored to me in the most public way possible. But accepting the commission would mean more than just personal vindication. It would mean choosing military values over family comfort, choosing truth over social convenience, choosing my own career over the relationships that had defined my identity for decades. I looked at my family, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time in years. Anthony, whose business empire was built on leveraging military connections while denying military service. My mother, whose social positioning had required erasing her daughter's achievements. Luis, whose silence had enabled systematic betrayal while preserving his own comfort. They were my family, flawed and selfish and cruel in ways that had nearly destroyed me. But they were also human beings who had made terrible choices out of fear, ambition, and social pressure. The question wasn't whether they deserved forgiveness, but whether I could build a future that honored my service without being defined by their failure. Admiral Hayes, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision I was making. I accept the commission with gratitude and with the understanding that service to something larger than family dynamics is the highest calling any soldier can embrace. The acceptance sent another wave of applause through the ballroom, but it also marked a fundamental shift in the Rodriguez family dynamic. I was choosing military values over family loyalty, truth over convenience, personal integrity over social harmony. The daughter they had tried to erase was claiming her place not just in tonight's narrative, but in the future they would all have to navigate. My father's smile was the first genuine expression of pride I had seen from him in years. Admiral Hayes nodded approvingly, understanding that she had witnessed not just the restoration of military honor but the birth of a new kind of family relationship based on respect rather than manipulation. But Anthony looked devastated, perhaps finally understanding that his business model of leveraging family military connections while denying family military service was no longer sustainable. My mother was crying again, but these tears seemed different, carrying grief for the daughter she had failed to honor and the family unity that could never be fully restored. Luis stepped forward, his movement hesitant but determined. For the first time all evening he looked directly at me, his eyes reflecting years of guilt and regret that were finally finding expression. Carmen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need you to know that I'm proud of your service. I've always been proud, even when I was too afraid to say so. The acknowledgement was small, inadequate compared to years of silence and complicity. But it was also genuine in a way that created space for the possibility of rebuilt relationship. Luis was choosing honesty over comfort, truth over family politics, and that choice mattered more than grand gestures or dramatic apologies. My mother approached slowly, her elegant composure finally replaced by something more authentic. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, her voice thick with emotion, but I need you to know that watching you tonight, seeing who you really are, I finally understand what I lost when I chose social convenience over family pride. The apology was incomplete, self-serving in ways that reflected years of prioritizing image over substance. But it was also a recognition of failure that created the possibility of different choices in the future. My mother was acknowledging that her social priorities had cost her something irreplaceable, and that acknowledgement was the first step toward rebuilding trust. Even Anthony managed a grudging nod of recognition, his business instinct perhaps calculating the advantages of having a newly commissioned officer in the family while his personal conscience grappled with the exposure of his systematic betrayal of military value. His acknowledgement was the least generous, the most calculated, but it was also a recognition that the family dynamic he had dominated for years was permanently altered. Admiral Hayes raised her hand to quiet the applause, her expression indicating that the evening's proceedings were approaching their formal conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have witnessed something remarkable. We have seen how military families can both embody and betray the values that define our profession. We have learned about service that goes unrecognized because recognition would compromise effectiveness. And we have watched as truth and courage overcome years of systematic deception. She paused, looking around the ballroom at faces that reflected everything from admiration to shock to uncomfortable recognition of their own complicity in social systems that prioritized convenience over honor. But most importantly, We have seen that it is never too late to choose truth over comfort, service over convenience, and family honor over family politics. The formal ceremony concluded with military precision, but the personal reckonings were just beginning. As guests began filing out of the ballroom, expressing congratulations and condolences in equal measure, I found myself standing with my father in a moment of quiet recognition that transcended years of misunderstanding and manipulation. "General Rodriguez," I said, testing the sound of his new rank, "thank you for finally choosing truth over family unity." His smile was sad but genuine, reflecting the complex emotions of someone who had gained recognition while losing the comfortable illusions that had defined his family relationship. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," he replied, using my new rank for the first time, "thank you for never losing sight of what service really means." The conversation was formal, almost ceremonial, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. We were no longer just father and daughter bound by blood and shared history. We were fellow officers committed to values that transcended personal comfort and social convenience. As the evening wound down and the ballroom slowly emptied, I stood with Admiral Hayes reviewing the paperwork that would restore my military career and reshape my family relation. The commission papers felt substantial in my hands, representing not just personal vindication, but the opportunity to build a future defined by service rather than family dysfunction. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Admiral Hayes said, her tone shifting from formal to personal, "you should know that your decision tonight represents exactly the kind of courage that defines military leadership at its highest levels. Choosing truth over comfort, service over convenience, honor over family politics, these are the decisions that separate true leaders from those who simply wear the uniform." Her words carried the weight of decades spent evaluating military personnel, understanding that character was revealed not in moments of obvious heroism, but in choices between competing loyalties and values. Tonight had been my test, and I had chosen service over family, truth over social harmony, personal integrity over collective comfort. 6 months later, I stood in my new Pentagon office, reviewing strategic planning documents that would shape military operations for years to come. The commission had led to exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work I had dreamed of during my enlisted year. My Bronze Star sat on my desk alongside commendations for my strategic planning work, visible reminders that military achievement was valued and recognized when pursued in environments that prioritized substance over politics. My relationship with my family had evolved into something more honest if less comfortable than our previous dynamic. Anthony's business had survived the exposure of his systematic manipulation of military connections, but his approach had become more transparent, more genuinely supportive of military families rather than exploitative of military image. My mother had channeled her social skills into legitimate military spouse advocacy, using her organizational abilities to support families dealing with deployment challenges rather than managing narratives for social advancement. Luis had become the family member I was closest to. His engineering work now focused on projects that genuinely supported military infrastructure rather than simply profiting from military contracts. His decision to speak honestly that night had marked the beginning of a rebuilt relationship based on mutual respect rather than shared complicity and comfortable lives. My father, now fully retired with general rank, had become a mentor figure for military families dealing with complex dynamics between service and civilian life. His willingness to expose family dysfunction in service of military values had earned respect throughout the military community, demonstrating that true leadership sometimes required sacrificing personal comfort for larger principles. The Rodriguez family would never again be the socially polished unit that had dominated North Carolina military circles through careful image management and selective truth-telling. But we had become something more valuable, a family that understood the difference between appearance and substance, between comfort and honor, between family loyalty and family truth. As I worked in my Pentagon office, reviewing strategic documents that would protect American lives in future conflicts, I often thought about that night at Fort Braxton, when truth finally triumphed over convenience. The cost had been enormous, requiring all of us to confront uncomfortable realities about loyalty, service, and the difference between supporting military families and exploiting military connections. But the result had been worth every moment of discomfort and disruption. Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez had been erased from family narratives designed to prioritize social convenience over military honor. Lieutenant Carmen Rodriguez had claimed her place in military history through service that honored both personal achievement and family legacy, understood correctly rather than manipulated for social advantage. The evening that had begun with exclusion and betrayal had ended with commission and recognition, But more importantly, it had demonstrated that truth and courage could overcome years of systematic deception, when pursued with enough determination and supported by people who understood that some values transcended family comfort. Military service, I had learned, was not just about individual achievement or family pride. It was about choosing something larger than personal convenience, something more important than social positioning, something more valuable than comfortable lives. And sometimes that choice required sacrificing the family unity you had always craved in order to claim the honor you had always earned. The ballroom at Fort Braxton had been the scene of my family's final betrayal and my personal vindication, but it had also been the birthplace of a new understanding of what military families could become when they chose truth over comfort, service over convenience, and honor over politics. That night had changed everything, and in the years that followed I had built a life worthy of the sacrifice and recognition that had made it possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.